The arrow struck the ground 3 inches from James Calloway's boot, and he knew immediately that running would mean death. He raised his hands slowly, letting his rifle slip from his shoulder to hang by its strap, and turned to face the ring of Apache warriors emerging from the desert scrub like spirits materializing from the very dust itself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the New Mexico territory, and in those shadows, James saw his own reckoning approaching with silent, measured steps. He had been tracking them for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of following cold trails and disturbed earth, of reading signs in broken branches and scattered stones, of studying their movements with the methodical patience that had made him the most sought-after man in the territory. James Calloway, the hunter, they called him. The man who never failed. The man who had cleared 3 counties of what the railroad magnates and cattle barons called the Indian problem. His reputation was forged in blood and sealed with gold, each successful campaign adding another layer to the legend, another stack of bills to the leather satchel he kept hidden beneath his bedroll. But reputation meant nothing to the 7 warriors surrounding him now, their faces painted for war, their eyes hard as obsidian. The tallest among them, a man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, moved forward and spoke in Apache. James shook his head, keeping his hands raised, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that threatened to crack bone. "I don't understand," James said, hating the tremor in his voice, the weakness it revealed. The scarred warrior's eyes narrowed. He barked an order, and rough hands seized James, stripping him of his weapons with efficient brutality. They found his rifle, his pistol, the knife in his boot, the smaller blade hidden at the small of his back. They found his canteen and his provisions. But they didn't find the folded paper tucked into the secret pocket of his vest, the contract bearing the seal of the territorial governor and the promise of $5,000 upon completion of his task, the complete elimination of the Chiricahua band led by Chief Nantich. Extermination. That was the word the governor had used, said with the casual indifference of a man ordering the removal of vermin from a granary. James had nodded, taken the contract, and ridden out the next morning. It was business. It had always been business. He had learned long ago not to think of them as people, not to consider the women and children, the elders, and the young men barely old enough to draw a bow. They were obstacles to progress, impediments to civilization, problems requiring solutions. The logic was simple, clean, uncomplicated by morality or doubt. The warriors bound his wrists with leather cord that bit into his flesh, then one of them shoved him forward. They moved through the desert with the fluid grace of men who knew every stone and shadow, while James stumbled over rocks he couldn't see and struggled to maintain his footing on slopes that seemed to shift beneath his boots. Hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that might have been beautiful if James hadn't been certain he was watching his last sunset. When they finally reached the Apache camp, full darkness had fallen, and the scattered fires created pools of warm light in the vast ocean of night. James was pulled through the camp, aware of eyes watching from every direction, of faces emerging from the darkness to stare at the white man in their midst. Children peered from behind their mothers' legs. Old men sat by fires, their weathered faces expressionless. Young warriors touched their weapons, anticipating violence. They threw him into a small shelter made of brush and hide, and 2 guards took position at the entrance. James collapsed onto the hard ground, his body screaming with fatigue, his mind racing through scenarios of escape that all ended in arrows or bullets. He had killed so many of them. He had burned villages and poisoned water sources and led cavalry charges at dawn when families were just waking. He had done these things without hesitation, without remorse, and now he was alone in the heart of an Apache camp, at the mercy of people he had spent 6 years hunting. He didn't sleep. How could he? Every sound outside the shelter was the prelude to execution, every murmur of voices the debate over how he should die. The Apache were creative in such matters, he knew. He had seen the aftermath of their vengeance, had documented their capacity for cruelty in reports that justified further violence against them. Now that same capacity would be turned on him, and there would be no one to document his suffering, no one to transform his agony into political leverage. Dawn came with shocking gentleness, light filtering through the gaps in the shelter's walls like a promise the world didn't intend to keep. The guards pulled him out and brought him before an old man sitting beside a low fire. This was Chief Nantich, James realized with a cold shock of recognition. He had studied drawings of this man, had memorized the descriptions provided by army scouts and former captives. The chief was older than James had expected, his face a map of deep lines and hard years, his hair nearly white, his hands gnarled but steady as they rested on his knees. Beside the chief sat a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested both strength and education. She studied James with unconcealed curiosity, then spoke in English that carried only the slightest trace of an accent. "My grandfather asks why you follow us," she said. "Why you track our people through the desert like an animal hunts prey." James's throat was dry, his voice cracked when he spoke. "I was lost. I meant no harm." The young woman translated, and Chief Nantich's expression didn't change. He spoke again, his voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of iron. "My grandfather says you lie," the woman translated. "He says you carry yourself like a soldier, like a man who knows killing. He asks again, why do you hunt us? The truth would mean immediate death. A continued lie might buy time, might create an opening for escape." James calculated odds and angles, running through possibilities with the cold assessment that had kept him alive through a dozen dangerous situations. "I hunt no one," he said. "I'm a surveyor, working for the railroad. I was separated from my party 2 weeks ago." Another lie, another translation, another measured response from the chief. But this time, the young woman's eyes flickered with something that might have been disappointment. "My grandfather says that if you are a surveyor, you will help us understand the marks on a paper his scouts found on a dead soldier 3 moons ago," she said. "He says that if you are truly what you claim, this will be a simple task for you." She reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a folded document, and James felt his blood turn to ice. He recognized it even before she unfolded it. It was a territorial map, marked with X's indicating Apache camps, annotated with numbers estimating population and fighting strength. It was one of his own maps, created during his previous campaign in the White Mountains, copied and distributed to cavalry units across the territory. She held it out to him, and their eyes met. In that moment, James understood with absolute certainty that she knew he was lying, that perhaps they had all known from the beginning. This was not an interrogation. It was a test, and he had already failed it. "Tell your grandfather," James said quietly, abandoning deception because there was no longer any point to it, "that I am not a surveyor." The woman translated, and Chief Nantich nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. He spoke at length, his words measured and deliberate, and the young woman listened carefully before turning back to James. "My grandfather says that you are the one they call the hunter. The man who burned the village at Cañon de los Embudos. The man who led the soldiers to the winter camp at Tres Castillos. The man responsible for the deaths of 43 people in the White Mountains, including my grandfather's son and his son's wife." Her voice remained steady, but James saw her hands tremble slightly. "He says you have come to finish what you started. To kill what remains of our people." "Yes," James said, "because there was terrible freedom in truth after so much lying." "Then you will die," she said simply. "Yes," James agreed. But Chief Nantich spoke again, and the young woman's face registered surprise. She argued with him in rapid Apache, her voice rising with emotion, but the old chief raised his hand and she fell silent. "My grandfather says that you will not die today," she translated, confusion evident in her tone. "He says that before you die, you will live among us. You will see what you came to destroy. You will know who you intended to kill." She paused, clearly struggling with her own feelings about this decree. "My grandfather says that a man should understand the weight of his own evil before he carries it into the next world." They took him to a shelter at the edge of the camp and assigned him guard. Over the following days, James existed in a strange limbo between prisoner and observer. He was not free to leave, but neither was he confined to the shelter. My grandfather has decided, Eisenachlesh said without preamble. Tomorrow at dawn, the council will meet to determine how you will die. There are some who wish to make your death slow, to balance the suffering you have caused. Others argue for a quick end, saying that vengeance changes nothing and only adds more sorrow to a world already too full of it. She paused, her eyes searching his face. My grandfather asks if you have anything to say before the council meets. James had spent 4 weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing speeches of apology and pleas for mercy, constructing arguments for his survival. But now, facing the old chief across the fire, all those careful words evaporated. What remained was only truth, raw and unvarnished. I came here to kill you all, James said quietly. I have been paid to exterminate your people like they were rats in a grain store. I have done this work for 6 years, in 3 territories, and I never questioned it because I made myself believe you weren't fully human. I convinced myself that what I did was necessary, even righteous. I told myself I was advancing civilization, making the world safe for progress. He looked down at his hands, seeing blood there that no amount of washing would ever remove. I was wrong. I was so profoundly, terribly wrong. Eisenachlesh translated, and Chief Nantage listened without expression. When she finished, the old man spoke at length, his voice carrying the weight of years and loss and wisdom earned through suffering. My grandfather says that many white men come to understand their error only when they face the consequences of it, Eisenachlesh translated. He says that regret born from fear of death is not genuine transformation. He asks, if we released you tomorrow, if we sent you back to the world of contracts and gold coins, would you remain changed? Or would you return to being the hunter, empty and efficient? It was the question James had been asking himself for weeks, lying awake in darkness, watching the slow wheel of stars through gaps in the shelter's roof. Would this change last? Or was it merely the product of circumstance, a temporary moral flexibility that would vanish as soon as he was safe? I don't know, James said, and the honesty of it felt like stripping away the last of his armor. I want to tell you that I would be different, that I would never take another contract, that I would spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I've done. But I've spent 6 years becoming someone else, someone I don't know how to stop being. I'm afraid that the hunter is all that's left of me. The translation seemed to take longer this time, and James saw something shift in the chief's weathered face, some subtle softening around the eyes. When Eisenachlesh spoke again, her voice was gentler. My grandfather says that a man who knows his own weakness is closer to strength than a man who believes himself already strong. He says that your honesty has weight, even if your certainty does not. She hesitated, then added, he has decided to tell you a story. Chief Nantage began speaking, his words flowing like water over stone, and Eisenachlesh translated with careful attention, determined to capture not just the meaning but the spirit of what her grandfather said. When my grandfather was young, younger than you are now, there was a great war between his band and another Apache clan from the mountains to the east. The war had gone on for many years, begun over some grievance so old that no one could remember what started it. Both sides had lost many warriors, many families. Both sides believed absolutely in the righteousness of their cause. My grandfather's father was chief then, and he was a great warrior, fearless and skilled in battle. He taught my grandfather to hate the Eastern clan, to see them as enemies who must be destroyed completely. One winter, when my grandfather was 19 years old, he was part of a raiding party that attacked an Eastern clan camp. They killed many warriors and took captives, including a young woman named Kai. She was brought back to the camp, and the council debated whether she should be killed or enslaved. My grandfather argued for her death, saying she was the daughter of an enemy chief and would only bring trouble. But my grandfather's mother intervened. She was a woman of great wisdom, though her power was quiet rather than loud. She said that Kai would live with her, would be treated as a daughter, and that anyone who wished to harm her would answer to my great-grandmother personally. No one argued with her. She was much respected, and her word carried authority that even the chief acknowledged. So Kai lived among them. And my grandfather, who had argued for her death, was assigned to guard her to ensure she did not escape. For months, he watched her with suspicion and hatred, seeing only the enemy in her face. But my great-grandmother was wise and patient. She made my grandfather responsible for teaching Kai their language, for ensuring she learned their ways. She forced him to see Kai not as a category but as a person. Slowly, despite his resistance, my grandfather began to know her. He learned that she loved songs and had a gift for healing. He learned that she mourned her own losses as deeply as he mourned his. He learned that she was funny and kind and sometimes sad in ways that had nothing to do with being a captive. He learned that the lines he had drawn between us and them were not natural boundaries but choices, decisions made and reinforced until they seemed like truth. After 2 years, the war between the clans ended through negotiation between the elders. Kai was offered the chance to return to her people, but she chose to stay. She had fallen in love with my grandfather, and he with her. They married, and she became my grandmother. She bore 4 children, including my mother. Everything that I am, everyone descended from my grandfather, exists because my great-grandmother refused to allow hatred to have the final word. Chief Nantich paused, and in the silence, James felt the story settle over him like weight and grace together. The old chief spoke again, briefly, and Eisenachlesh smiled slightly as she translated. My grandfather says that he has lived his entire life as evidence that enemies can become family, that the categories we use to divide people are less permanent than we imagine. He says that this is the gift his grandmother gave him, the knowledge that change is always possible, even when it seems impossible. Why are you telling me this? James asked, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer suppress. Because tomorrow the council meets to decide your fate, Eisenachlesh said. And my grandfather wanted you to understand that whatever they decide, you have a choice about who you become afterward, if there is an afterward. You can remain the hunter, or you can become someone else. But that choice is yours alone. No one can make it for you. That night, James didn't sleep at all. He sat in his shelter and thought about the story Chief Nantich had told, about the young warrior who learned to see past his hatred, about the wise woman who refused to let vengeance dictate the future. He thought about Eisenachlesh and Guyen and Nach and all the others whose names he now knew, whose faces had become familiar, whose humanity had broken through the careful walls he had built around his heart. He thought about the contract folded in his vest pocket, and what it represented. Not just money, but a way of seeing the world that reduced people to problems and violence to mathematics. He thought about all the contracts he had fulfilled before this one, all the villages burned and families scattered, all the deaths he had caused in the name of progress and civilization and gold. And for the first time in 6 years, James Calloway wept. He wept for the people he had killed, for the lives he had destroyed, for the man he had chosen to become. He wept for the emptiness he had cultivated so carefully, for the heart he had carved out and replaced with calculation. He wept until his body ached and his throat was raw, until the tears ran dry and left only a hollow exhaustion in their wake. When dawn came, pale and gentle through the shelter's walls, James was still awake. The guards came for him as the sun broke above the eastern hills, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose. They led him to the center of the camp, where the council had gathered in a circle. Chief Nantich sat at the north point, his face impassive. Eisenachlesh stood behind him, her eyes meeting James's with an expression he couldn't read. The debate lasted hours. James understood none of the words, but he understood the tone, the anger and pain and righteous fury that filled some voices, the calls for justice and retribution. He understood too the quieter voices that argued for mercy, that spoke of weariness with death and the need to preserve what remained rather than adding to the loss. Finally, Chief Nantich raised his hand, and the council fell silent. The old chief spoke for several minutes, his words deliberate and measured, and James watched the faces around the circle change as they listened. Some nodded. Others looked troubled or dissatisfied. When the chief finished, there was a long silence. Then one by one, the council members rose and walked away, until only Chief Nantich, Eisenachlesh, and the guards remained. The old chief stood with the careful movements of a man whose bones ached with age, and approached James.